Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to number 1 in the best sword-fighting films of all time. This film is one which perhaps most perfectly combines the art of the filmmaker with that of the fight choreographer. So much so that there is so much to talk about on both of these fronts that this review will need to be split into 2 parts, but not, say, the 38 parts of a typical anti-tracker film review, for example. And so, it can truly be said that this top 10 list goes up to 11.
And here, all the way up, all the way up,
Yeah.
all the way up. You're on 10 on your guitar. Where can you go from there? Where?
I don't know.
Nowhere, exactly. What we do is if we need that extra push over the cliff, you know what we do?
Put it up to 11.
11, exactly. One louder.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
And so it is that I must reveal the final top-placed film, and it is The Three Musketeers 1973 and The Four Musketeers 1975. But wait, that's 2 films. You can't. Shut up, you fool! Oh, sorry. I think I must have absorbed a little bit too much of the characters of the masters from the last video that I made. But to address more fairly the point that I cut off there as to allowing these 2 films to occupy the top spot, number 1, I would say, this is my series. And 2, the 2 films themselves were originally intended to be 1 film. This is because the production company ran out of money halfway through making the films, and so they paused halfway, cut the first half into 1 film, released it, and used the money from that release to complete the film and make the second half. This is perhaps most obvious through the end titles of The Three Musketeers 1973, where it basically trails the next half of the movie, or the next movie, The Four Musketeers. And to a lesser degree, but still fairly obvious, is the beginning of The Four Musketeers, where again they recap in the title sequence everything that's happened so far in The Three Musketeers.
Yes, I remember that day when young D'Artagnan was made a musketeer of the king.
Although this was an accident, and this may very well have been lightning in a bottle, this is something that could never be recreated. By doing so, they produced 2 excellent films that tell the story of Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers absolutely perfectly, with a split not only in the story and the narrative, but also in tone. The book itself, The Three Musketeers, was initially serialized when first published. It was not published as a novel, it was published as a serial adventure in magazine form, and later combined into 1 volume as a book. But that meant that there were already natural breakpoints within the story. In particular, the breakpoint they chose was the successful completion of the mission recovering the diamonds from the Duke of Buckingham for the Queen, the upshot of which is that D'Artagnan is finally made a musketeer, which he is not throughout the whole of the first film. Then in the second film, naturally enough, they can change the title to The Four Musketeers and tell the second half of the story, which is more the dangerous machinations of Milady de Winter. The 2 films do have a different tone as well. The first film is much more of a light-hearted adventure, with some dangers and perils, of course, but there's definitely a more jocular attitude in the way that it's presented. The second film, while retaining much of this humour and comedy, has much more tragedy and much more character development in many ways than the first half, and having this natural break between the films allows the different tones to breathe in each film more completely. I shall talk about this in more detail very shortly in this video. The 2 videos are going to be split as follows. The first video will cover the cinematography, the characters, the actors, the filmmaking, the direction, etc., while the second film will be the one concentrating solely on the fights themselves. And while there may be some overlap between these 2, and where necessary, I will talk about the fights and fight choreography when referring to the cinematography, and where necessary, when talking about the fights, I will refer back to the cinematography. This is how the 2 films will be split by and large. One final thing that I will mention before moving into the bulk of this video is that anyone who's already familiar with these films and has a keen eye may well already have guessed that these films would be the #1 spot, since the title cards for all of these videos are taken from and altered from a still from the opening titles of The Three Musketeers. And of course, before this series even started, the prelude to the series was the short video on the cameo that Bill Hobbs, the fight choreographer for these films, made in the film itself. Anyway, I hope that didn't spoil it for too many people. While I will probably cover most of Bill Hobbs' contribution to the film through the second video and the fights themselves, almost letting them speak for him, I will do a quick summary of how his choreography helped make these not just my favourite sword fighting films of all time, but probably my favourite films of all time, even though I love Star Wars, Highlander, Star Trek movies, the original series ones obviously, and many other films as well besides. As evidenced by the multiple times I watched these films, The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers stand with them in this category of multiple watchings which I will never tire of, and yet the impressions these films have left is stronger still. It has influenced my life, perhaps in more ways than the others even have. It is probably these films which made me want to become a fencer. Admittedly, all the sword fighting films have had that effect, but these two films, because of the cinematography combined with the fight choreography, have left such an impression, backed by such an incredible story told by Alexandre Dumas, a classic, and rightly so. I will stand by that statement. I think these two films are my favourite films of all time. Bill contributed to this through the way in which the characters' fighting styles reflected their personalities. Now, my connection to Bill Hobbs has been covered in more detail in previous films in which he was the fight choreographer, so I'm not going to retread that ground here now. And he was a great guy, but he was also rightly well respected as a professional fight choreographer because of this eye for character. He could also incorporate comedy and drama into the fights without undermining the reality of the fight. And of course, he had a fantastic eye for historical detail. All of these will come up in the second video as I go through the fights themselves, but it was worth pointing it out here because this film would be incomplete without mentioning Bill Hobbs' contribution to the greatness of these films. Both of these films, The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, were produced by the illustrious filmmaking family of Michael Salkind, Alexander Salkind, and Ilya Salkind, who are grandfather, father, and son, respectively. And these names will be most familiar, I suspect, to many of my audience through their production of the Superman films, Superman 1, 2, and 3, and Supergirl as well. But while they may have organised the money and the production of these films, the look and feel of the film almost certainly more directly comes from the director, who is Richard Lester. Richard Lester is an unusual character in terms of direction, an American director who primarily based his life and his work in the UK, and prior to these films was more famously known for quirky, strange productions such as the Beatles films, e.g. A Hard Day's Night, and slightly more obscure films such as transferring Spike Milligan's plays into motion picture form. Spike Milligan, for those who don't know, was founder member and writer for a radio series in the 50s up to 1960 called The Goon Show. The Goon Show itself inspired later surreal and satirical comedy, in particular the Monty Python team. You may wonder why I'm making reference to all of these people at this point, but this will become clear very shortly. One further thing I'll say about The Goon Show is that my father was very into The Goon Show, and he had a book of one of the scripts of one of the series at my grandparents', and when I was a child, I was taken to my grandparents by my parents. This was one of the few books that was in the bedroom that I was staying in, and I then read it as a relatively young child, and I too loved the insane, crazy comedy that Spike Milligan had written. Many years later, I actually heard radio productions when either myself or my brother, I forget who, got cassettes of them and we listened to them. Spike Milligan is a genius, and a tortured genius, who suffered from manic depression, which almost certainly was brought on by shell shock, or what we would now call PTSD, suffered during the Second World War in the North African and Italian campaigns, which is also where he met one of the other Goon Show stars, Harry Seacombe, and later they got together with Peter Sellers and others to produce the show. He once famously had a nervous breakdown live on air while recording one of the Goon Show episodes itself, and people didn't realise because they just assumed it was part of the insane humour that his everyday writing usually produced. Returning to Richard Lester, obviously dealing with Spike Milligan shows his penchant for the unusual, the weird, and the slightly surreal or strange. And this comes through in The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, and somehow fits perfectly. Again, it is one of the elements which makes these films stand out above almost any other film I can think of. These films are almost like a painting by Bruegel or Bosch, in that every scene is filled with life, and you can hear it in the dialogue. And it's not just that the dialogue is in the background going rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb. There is actual written dialogue underlaying the action you can see in the scenes. Even if the main characters aren't talking, the minor characters in the background have their own little stories, little vignettes going on, which lends layers to the film, again lifting it above the commonplace.
Not to worry, dear. We've seen the signal for these before. In they go. Up and up they go. Let me get your hands. Moment. Rats. This is trouble.
Money for a blind man. Going down here. Oh, dear. Money for a cripple. Money for a cripple. Money for a cripple.
Get off!
Money for a cripple. Money for a cripple.
Me?
Not your day, is it? Money for an orphan?
Money for a war veteran. That's money for a war veteran. Here. Yes. Oh. Money for a war veteran. Money for war veteran.
Money. Before you go, sir. Money for an excluded labor, sir. I say, sir, before you climb. Sir, you wouldn't have any odd change in.
This tactic of giving life to the minor characters hasn't always worked in Richard Lester's favour, I feel. Later, the Salkind team gave him control of Superman 2 after removing Richard Donner from the production. And as we can see in this scene here, which actually, if you've seen the 2006 Richard Donner cut, isn't in that version, this is where I think Richard Lester's quirky style actually undercuts the way Superman 2 was put together. Particularly, pay attention to Zod's strange at the end of the scene, which is very much what a lot of the minor characters, even major characters, might do in the Three Musketeers and Four Musketeers, and yet somehow it works in that context and adds to the film, whereas in Superman 2, Richard Lester's style and comedic elements seems to reduce the impact of the film significantly, particularly when you compare it with the original Superman 1, which is entirely under the control of Richard Donner. Anyway, here is the scene.
Hey, sweet thing. Sit them buns down here.
Let's just hold hands.
Let me know if this tickles.
I think you can see what I mean with this particular bit of Zod again. Where it really makes a character who shouldn't be comedic significantly less threatening. The other reason I included this scene was it may seem familiar to moviegoers who've seen more recent films. I'm thinking of the scene with Captain Marvel, which was reduced in the cinematic release but released in a longer form in, I believe, the DVD extras. And we can see here that, in fact, it's familiar because Captain Marvel is basically just Ursa, i.e. one of the main villains. Having just pointed out how Richard Lester's style did not lend itself well to Superman 2, I have to emphasize that this in no way detracts from his genius. Richard Lester makes these films. Literally, he made the films, but his style, his unique way of filmmaking, gives us these two perfect works of art which would otherwise not exist. One final point I'd like to make is that Richard Lester, I feel, definitely influenced other filmmakers, specifically Terry Gilliam, and very specifically Terry Gilliam's shooting of The Life of Brian. Now, I've always thought of Terry Gilliam as being a very unique director who very much has his own mark and stamp on every work he's ever produced, but I guess nobody lives in isolation, and it is undeniable there's a lot of visual similarity between certain scenes in The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers.
I do know the Queen gave Buckingham the 12 diamond studs that the King presented to the Queen on her last birthday. Where Buckingham went after that evidence, I do not know.
Spare me a recitation of all the things you do not know. Buckingham will be in Calais before you're done.
Only your Grace.
I'll let him go for the present.
No! Don't like this! No, please, no more! It hurts!
It's supposed to. You have deceived me. Deceived me. Thinking that you were a traitor. Rise, my friend. Mr. Bonacieux, what am I to say? I find that our suspicions about you were entirely unjust.
The Cardinal has taken my hand and called me friend.
Oh, we must make you better amends than that. Take these 100 pistoles and forgive me.
I forgive your eminence. You cannot mean that. I mean, what am I? I am nothing. Better, I'm less than nothing.
Friend, you are generous. Well then, adieu. Or better still, au revoir, for I hope that you will come to visit me again so that we can talk together. Until our next meeting.
Oh, did you hear that? We're going to talk together. Isn't that lovely? Did you hear that, Philip?
Your soul has been corrupted. You shall not inherit the kingdom of God.
When do we leave? At once.
Salvation.
Marshal, we'll get our horses.
We take no other servants. A gentleman may reveal his secrets by accident. A servant invariably sells them. Or another thing, once we're on this road, if one of us goes down, the other three go on with a letter. The one who falls takes his chance. Agreed?
May one ask, delicately, the cause in which we're being expected to die? When we go on a campaign, does the king give us reasons? He says, Porthos, fight, and you fight.
I do.
Then let's go and be killed where we're told to. Is life worth so many questions?
No.
And in The Life of Brian. And I am almost certain that Terry Gilliam was in some way influenced by Richard Lester, and probably specifically the production of these two films. The Life of Brian, of course, came out in 1979, so about 6 years later than these two films. Plenty of time for the ideas and the imagery to have percolated through Terry Gilliam's own imagination. One final remark to tie all of these numerous and at sometimes apparently disparate cinematic threads together, you might recognise Spike Milligan from his cameo in The Life of Brian, seen here.
He has given us a sign! He has given us a shoe! The shoe is the sign! Let us follow his example! What? Let us, like him, hold up one shoe and let the other be upon our foot, for this is his sign that all who follow him shall do likewise! Yes. No, the shoe is a sign that we must gather shoes together in abundance!
Cast off the shoes! Follow the gourd!
No, let us gather shoes together! Let me!
No, it is a sign that, like him, we must think not of the things of the body, but of the face and head.
Give me your shoe!
Get off!
Follow the gourd! The holy gourd of Jerusalem!
The gourd! Hold up the sandal as he has commanded us! It is a shoe! It's a sandal!
No, it is not a shoe!
Cast it away!
Put it on!
Clear off!
Take the shoes and follow him! Stop! Let us pray. Yea, he cometh to us like the seeds of the grave.
Next up, I'd like to talk about the music, which you've already heard snatches of throughout the other clips that have been shown. The music was primarily, at least in The Three Musketeers, written by Michel Legrand, who has a long and illustrious career in scoring movies. And as well as the stirring title music, he also, of course, orchestrated the various incidental music, including the court music that was used in various scenes, as we can see here.
Faster! Oh, faster, you don'ts! Oh, come on, somebody, make them go faster with them! Oh, it's wonderful, it is absolutely wonderful!
However, Michel Legrand did not have sole music credits for The Three Musketeers. Lalo Schifrin also gets a credit, and in The Four Musketeers, he gets sole music writing credit, despite the fact that they reused the themes from the 1973 film. Perhaps most distinctive of the Lalo Schifrin contributions is Athos' theme, which you can hear in the background of this very tense scene between Athos and Milady.
And you know this. You kill Buckingham or have him killed, it's no matter to me. He's an Englishman and an enemy. But you touch one hair of D'Artagnan's head, and I swear as God is my judge, I'll break you on the wheel with my own hand.
No. Monsieur D'Artagnan has assaulted me, insulted me.
Since when has it been possible to insult you, madam?
And he will die for it.
Have you ever seen a woman shot in the stomach? You know me, milady. Give me the papers the Cardinal wrote just now. I'll give you 5 seconds. Very well. One, 2, 3, 4. By my order and for the good of the state. The bearer has done what has been done. Richelieu. Clever and subtle man, our dear Cardinal. He gives you what you want without leaving evidence against himself. Unfortunately, you won't have time to run messages to him before your ship leaves. Bon voyage.
Lalo Schifrin, of course, is famous for themes such as Dirty Harry and Mission Impossible, among others. Before moving on to discuss the cast of The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, a cast which was not only sizable but also star-studded, and almost certainly the reason why the film ran short of money halfway through and ended up being split into two, I'll briefly mention where the film was shot, which was predominantly in Spain, not France. This explains why Paris and La Rochelle look considerably sunnier and drier than you would expect Paris and La Rochelle to look. And so we come to the last and probably the largest section of this first video in the two-part number one in the best sword fighting films of all time. In other words, going through the amazing cast. As mentioned, this is probably where most of the expense on the film went, because whether the characters were a major role or a minor role, some incredibly strong and presumably expensive talents were employed in these roles across the entire film. Both films, in fact. It is difficult to know the most efficient way to approach this catalogue of fine acting talent, so I've decided to go through roughly in the order in which they appear in the film, rather than necessarily their relative importance as a character. This may seem a little odd, but it just seemed the most efficient way to just plough through the many famous faces, and in some cases less famous faces, but nevertheless talented actors employed in these two masterpieces. And so in the opening titles, we see Joss Ackland, playing D'Artagnan's dad, practice fighting with D'Artagnan himself, played by Michael York.
It'll serve me well. As you can see.
Yes, Father. Won't you sit down, sir?
No. Time is short. You must be off. Oh, I've given you my secret thrust. I'll give you also these 15 crowns. And this. Your grandfather bore this sword against the Moors at Lepanto. I made some use of it under the late King Henry. Huh? Now it is yours. It will introduce you to Monsieur Treville, who commands the King's Musketeers. You'll remember it well. And me.
Joss Ackland, at the time of recording, is still alive at the age of 91 and has played numerous roles on the stage and screen over his many decades in the business. Michael York plays the young D'Artagnan, as with many roles in many films adapted from books. None of the actors are really the ages they should be. D'Artagnan should be in his mid-late teens in The Three Musketeers. The other Musketeers, the older Three Musketeers themselves, Athos, Porthos and Aramis, should be in their 20s at most. Of course, none of the actors playing those roles are in their 20s either, and Michael York is definitely not in his teens. However, he has the right youthful exuberance and a level of naivety that you would expect in a character of that age, and so he pulls off the role in a convincing fashion.
Come on.
Decidedly, it is someone riding a buttercup. Unless it is a cheese with legs.
I know what you laugh at, sir, and we will laugh together, if you speak to me.
If you were a gentleman, I would speak to you. I was speaking at you, sir.
But I am speaking to you, sir. Turn if you're a man. Let us see you laugh now. Ah! Oh!
These Gascons.
Shall I cut his throat?
No. Put him on his ridiculous horse and let him go.
Michael York you might recognise from Logan's Run, for example, or much later in his career as Arthur in Babylon 5. Almost as soon as D'Artagnan leaves home, he runs into the man who will turn out to be his main antagonist throughout the entirety of the two films, even if he is himself more of a flunky or henchman to Cardinal Richelieu, almost a Vader figure to Richelieu's Palpatine. Of course, mentioning Star Wars at this point, many people will know Christopher Lee through Count Dooku in the prequels of Star Wars, and of course he was Saruman in Lord of the Rings films, but much earlier in his career, he obviously did the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers, and slightly before this, and in fact in parallel with these films, he was also playing Dracula in several Hammer horror films. His face is instantly recognisable, as is his deep and often sinister voice. This first encounter between D'Artagnan and Rochefort looks set to lead to a duel, but of course this is cut short by one of Rochefort's henchmen breaking D'Artagnan's weapon, just prior to Milady, another of our major villains in this story, arriving via carriage. Milady, played by Faye Dunaway.
No time to talk, my lady. The Cardinal commands you to England. You are to let him know the moment the Duke of Buckingham leaves London.
And then?
Await his further orders.
And you? When shall I see you again?
You? You assassin? I shall chastise you, sir. Oh, forgive me, madam, but I must kill your friend.
Are you not terrified?
Ha! Away, Bumpkin! You will hear from me.
He's very handsome. Even if he's broken lately.
Faye Dunaway does a fantastic job of portraying a cunning, driven, but often driven by spite and vengeance character, who while working for Richelieu is barely controlled by him in terms of wishing to pursue her own vengeances and her own desires. Faye Dunaway often ends up playing villains. She would work again for the Salkinds in Supergirl, playing the main villain in that also. Upon D'Artagnan's arrival at the Musketeers' headquarters in Paris, we finally get to meet the Three Musketeers proper, i.e. Porthos, Aramis and Athos, in that order. First, we have Porthos, played by Frank Finlay. This is not the only role Frank Finlay plays in the film, in fact, and I'll mention that in a moment. Suffice to say, Frank Finlay's over-the-top portrayal of Porthos is perfect for the character, a overblown, pompous, and largely comedic character in the film.
Thank you.
I do admire the belt, Porthos. I do. Oh, yes, when a museum man who must spend his money on fine shirts and the like. What?
or wants mistress's money.
Oh, no, Aramis, on my honour as a gentleman, my own money, all of 12 pistoles. Oh, a mere trifle, but it is gold pelting all the way round me.
Astonishing. There is enough gold in France to stretch all that distance?
Might I lift the costly cloak to admire the belt more? No, sir, your pardon, sir, no, I have a code.
Discretion being the better part of vanity.
I don't understand. I know the one about valour, but I don't agree. I can't agree to be discreet on how valiant I am. Shouldn't be asked.
The second role he plays, and I'm not entirely sure why, whether it was because he wanted to play that role for fun or wanted to get paid twice, I'm not entirely sure, but he also plays O'Reilly, the Duke of Buckingham's jeweller, who makes replica diamonds for him.
You shall kill yourself to return these studs to the Queen in time, sir.
But the missing ones, my lord.
O'Reilly, put a price on these. Each one, their worth.
Not English? Not English, no. I'd say, £500.
How long to make two of them?
A week?
I'll pay you £5,000 each if they're finished the day after tomorrow.
Done. Could that infer to my wife that I wouldn't be coming home?
I'll do better than that. Jackson, a carriage and escort of cavalry for Mistress O'Reilly. Prepare rooms for her.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Next, D'Artagnan meets Aramis, played by Richard Chamberlain, who, for people old enough, will remember him as Dr. Kildare in the 60s, but also playing a variety of TV and film roles throughout the 60s, 70s and beyond.
Oh, look! On the scaffolding. Forgive me, gentlemen. Oh, your pardon, sir. You dropped this.
Gold from a passing fancy, most discreet Aramis.
The purse is not mine, sir, nor did I drop it. Oh, your pardon, sir. I saw it fall.
You see a deal too much, sir. It is a fault among country-bred people.
I am a Gascon, sir.
And need to learn civilized behavior. Well, I am no bully, and as an intended priest, I fight only when I must. But you have compromised a lady. Shall we say the Hotel Treville at 2 o'clock?
Sir. Sir, your purse!
Richard Chamberlain's Aramis is a perfect sort of light, charming womanizer who is constantly professing that he will ultimately join the priesthood, even though this seems quite at odds with his behaviour. And finally we have Athos, played by Oliver Reed.
It's a very keen sort thrust. A souvenir from the Cardinal's Guards, eh, Monsieur Athos?
You're a liar, it's the smallpox.
Of course, one sees that immediately. I mean,
Don't pretend to know one from the other or it would make any difference to your treatment if you did.
Athos is perfectly cast, even though all the actors are too old for the Three Musketeers. He is perfectly cast as Athos. Given Athos's depth of character, his tortured background, his drinking to avoid it, much of this echoes character traits within Oliver Reed himself, who was quite a rascal and rabble-rouser, by all accounts, including his own, and was famous for drinking throughout most of his life. Of all the characters in the Three Musketeers, Athos is the one I identified most strongly with. I almost never have identified with a central character who is young and naive, even as a relatively small child. I never wanted to be D'Artagnan. I never wanted to be Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars movies. I wanted to be Han Solo. Characters I identified with most strongly tended to be those that were a little bit older and had some experience, were worldly wise, might have some moral ambiguity to their characters, in that they would be prepared to do things that were not necessarily strictly heroic, but maybe viewed as necessary to get to a certain goal, even if distasteful and unpleasant morally and ethically. That's not to say that I would do the things that Athos does, for example, in this film, but I can see why he comes to the conclusions he does, and his decisions are not based upon a whim or a superficial feeling or flight of fancy. They are informed by his experience, and I think that's where I'm really identifying with a character, when the character has experience and knowledge. So I always identified with characters like the Saint or the Falcon, who were more worldly wise and had seen the world and had been around the block a few times, and their cynicism was not simply some superficial shield and naive affectation. It was an informed response by experience, and under the cynicism there would be still a character that is tortured by the emotions of the things he's experienced and the emotions he sees around him, no matter how much he may try and shield himself through his manner or his drinking or whatever other mechanisms he used to try and cope. I'm also thinking here of Sherlock Holmes as a character I would actually identify with, as someone who's somewhat isolated and different and alone from most of the rest of humanity. Similarly with the Doctor in Doctor Who, throughout most of the portrayals anyway, a character who is separate from most others, has seen the world or the universe, and while still attempting to find adventure or find challenge or find experiences, is nonetheless a character who is affected by and has his attitudes and manners changed by his travels through the world, for better or worse. Another characteristic of Athos, which has stuck with me perhaps over the years, is something early on when he's about to fight his first duel with D'Artagnan, and he has an injured right shoulder, and states that he can fence just as easily with his left hand as his right hand.
But you did hurt my shoulder.
I trust it will not inconvenience you, sir. If you wish to postpone our meeting.
By no means. I fight just as well with my left hand. If you find this places you at a disadvantage, I do apologize.
You're very courteous, sir. I was going to add, about your wound. I have an ointment of my mother's. You might find soothing.
You overwhelm me, young man.
I'm going to get up, Dueling.
Oh, here come my seconds.
Are you fighting this fellow? But I'm meeting him myself.
But not till 1 o'clock, sir.
Oh, no. I shall fight him this afternoon.
At 2 o'clock, sir.
How long have you been in Paris?
Since 8 o'clock this morning.
You waste little time, sir.
My father recommended that I fight duels.
Well, let us hope you can do him some credit, hmm?
Recently, I have learnt to fence with my left hand, initially because of an injury to my right arm. And when I fence with my left hand rather than my right hand, thoughts go back not just to the Princess Bride, but also to Athos in The Three Musketeers. Oddly, although we see him preparing in this scene to fence with his left hand, as soon as they actually have to fight with the Cardinal's guards, all the way through that fight sequence, he's actually using his right hand, as you'll see in the second film when I cover the fight sequences. The final person that D'Artagnan meets in the Musketeers' headquarters is the commander of the guards, de Treville.
Your father says that you carry his old sword, Monsieur D'Artagnan.
Yes.
Oh, do me the honor of taking one on loan until yours grows longer.
Sir, I asked charity of no one.
Then you aren't likely to get it, are you, young man? No, not charity. Love and courtesy for the son of an old friend. To keep his enemies an inch or two further off.
In that case, sir, I do thank you.
That is as much as I can offer you. You see, there is no place in the Musketeers for any man until he has served in a campaign or otherwise distinguished himself in the killing. But what I can do is write a letter for Monsieur Dessart, who commands the guards, and will...
Who is a stern but kindly individual, played by George Wilson, one of two main actors in the film, who was redubbed by another British actor, uncredited. In this case, he was redubbed by Michael Hordern, who perhaps for British ears most famously voiced Paddington Bear in the 70s TV series Paddington. We also see here two instances, again, of Richard Lester's comedy coming through. First of all, in D'Artagnan's awkwardness in meeting de Treville, and then, during the meeting, when he's distracted by Rochefort out of the window and attempts to confront him with, again, comedic consequences.
You! You coward! I spit on you!
What?
Oh, not on you, sir. On that villain without the eye. You, sir. I said stop, sir! Yeah!
Oh.
This encounter with Rochefort is also what inadvertently, literally throws him into meeting Porthos, Athos, and Aramis as he rushes out to try and catch Rochefort. The next character that we see in the film is Planchet, D'Artagnan's loyal manservant, and we see D'Artagnan choosing him from a range of manservants after Planchet enthusiastically picks up his bag for him. Planchet is played by Roy Kinnear, and you can see him here in a scene much later on in the film The Three Musketeers.
No? The last place on earth we were all alive together. Till we meet again, my friends.
That won't be long.
Roy Kinnear was a famous character/comedy actor, often employed by Richard Lester, but also more commonly seen on British TV throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s in multiple comedic or character roles. He has very little dialogue in the film, but what dialogue he has, as with many of the minor characters in the film, adds layers of colour and interest to any scene. Even in the scene I showed you, there's just a little aside from Roy Kinnear's Planchet, which lightens the scene with its world-weary and resigned cynicism. I chose this scene to illustrate Planchet's character, partly because of the tragic nature of Roy Kinnear's death. Roy Kinnear died in 1989 while making a further sequel to The Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers called The Return of the Musketeers, which was in fact based upon Alexandre Dumas' novel 20 Years After. Tragically, Roy Kinnear died while filming a scene on horseback and died after falling off the horse, an accident which is tragically foreshadowed in this actual stunt in the film of The Three Musketeers, which we've seen here. Shortly after picking up Planchet, D'Artagnan goes to get lodgings and meets Monsieur Bonacieux, his landlord.
This is the staircase. I think you'll like it here, monsieur. For only 2 francs a day, this chamber, most scrubbulous. And scrupulously clean, as you'll observe. Slops emptied every second day, eh? And laundry done at a modest fee. The rascal will sleep out there. When Monsieur beats him for insolence, his screams will scarce be heard. Oh, no, Monsieur. They don't fall off trees. Chambers like these in Paris. And where else would you get such a magnificent view of the city? Oh.
Quite so, Mr. Bonacieux. Permit me to observe that this pigsty you call a room is not fit for a...
Played by Spike Milligan. And so the many tangled cinematic threads once again weave together here. Spike Milligan I've already covered in much more detail earlier. It is at this point that we also meet Madame Bonacieux, Constance Bonacieux, the wife of Monsieur Bonacieux, and the love interest for D'Artagnan. She's played by the beautiful Raquel Welch, as we can see in this scene here.
King or a cardinal, but it'll suit me very well. 2 francs, you see?
You take it?
Whenever it's offered.
Ah, Madame Bonacieux, my wife, Monsieur. Is she not beautiful?
Enchanting. Think.
She is as delicate as petals falling from a flower. Of course, you know that my wife is a dressmaker to the Queen. Very nice person, the Queen. My wife has her every confidence. Yes, I'm very proud of being her husband.
And, she lives here?
No, I live here. My beautiful Constance stays at the palace. I mean, where else? But she visits me once a week. Tonight, in fact.
Madam must look forward to that eagerly.
Yes.
Not only is Raquel Welch good at the physical comedy, as we can see in that last scene, but she also has good comic timing in the delivery of the dialogue too, as we can see in this scene.
Now, the best possible course is a good night's sleep. Try to forget about it.
Yes. I cannot sleep with my husband in the Bastille. I'm frightened.
Oh, I'm not. You ought to sleep with me. You need a good cuddle. Chase the frights away.
Monsieur, I must go to Her Majesty. She needs me urgently.
I cannot let you go. The streets are full of danger and your legs and feet are dirty.
Yes. Oh, Monsieur, you must help me. You are young and gallant, and my husband is just a weak man troubled with wind. Can I tell you? Can I trust you?
Oh, with your life, which beats in your breast. I hear it, the flutter of life, like a little white bird.
They seek no harm the Queen through me.
I can hear the wings.
The Cardinal wishes to ruin it. Because I'm in the Queen's confidence, perhaps he hopes to attack her through me.
You cannot go to the Queen with dirty legs.
No.
Are you strong enough to wash them?
No. Oh, my poor husband. Without him, I feel so helpless.
I have never washed the legs of a woman. I have done a horse. With a horse, you start at the top.
I cannot go dirty to the Queen. Do you think I will be safe here?
Oh, yes, Constance. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Both the characters of Planchet, as portrayed by Roy Kinnear, Monsieur Bonacieux, as portrayed by Spike Milligan, and Constance Bonacieux, as portrayed by Raquel Welch, all underscore Richard Lester's keen eye for comedic timing and the effective use of comedy in telling this story, mixed with other more tragic elements. Ultimately, Constance Bonacieux's character is the heart of the most tragic element of this story. Next, we meet the most important of villains in this story, at least in terms of the power that he wields. He is this film's palpi to Rochefort's Vader, namely Cardinal Richelieu. As you could see in that scene, Richelieu is played by Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston, of course, is an incredibly famous actor, famous for, among other things, Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes. The scene is beautifully acted, given there's no dialogue at all, and tells you everything you need to know about the character without a single word said. Richelieu exudes power by his eyes never leaving you, or in this case never leaving the camera, but giving the impression that he's always looking at you all the way through the scene. In addition, the crowd are not there willingly, they are paid fans for the Cardinal, and as soon as he has passed, they drift away into the streets to disappear. Charlton Heston is perfectly cast in this role and demonstrates his range of acting ability. He's not playing a hero in this, he's playing the villain, a subtle, cunning, measured villain, but a villain nonetheless. He clearly wishes to hold the reins of power through his influence over the weaker King Louis, to the extent that those reins of power would have to be wrested from his cold, dead hands. His subtle and largely dispassionate performance as Richelieu really underscores the sinister nature of this character, but also some level of ambiguity. When faced with defeat, instead of exacting vengeance, which he regards as an expensive luxury, he in fact extends some measure of a hand of friendship to D'Artagnan, or at least seeks to use D'Artagnan to further the good of the state and the good of France. Charlton Heston pulls off a very subtle performance in this, and should rightly be regarded as one of Hollywood's greatest acting stars. Soon after meeting Richelieu, we meet Queen Anne, played by Geraldine Chaplin, the daughter of Charlie Chaplin.
Faster! Oh, faster, you don't! Oh, come on, somebody make them go faster with them! Oh, it's wonderful. It is absolutely wonderful. I feel sick.
In the scene we just saw, Geraldine Chaplin is obviously playing a very spoilt, privileged aristocrat with all the money and privilege and lack of cares that one might expect for such a character. In fact, the only cares she has are the intrigues she creates herself, in this case, her long-distance love affair with the Duke of Buckingham, who we'll meet shortly. King Louis is played by Jean-Pierre Cassel and is the second of the actors in this film to have been redubbed by an English actor.
Queen to King's Knight 4.
Queen to King's Knight 4.
Your ruffians, Treville, have spiked 5 of the Cardinal's guards.
Your musketeers, Majesty.
Your ruffians.
Knight to King's Bishop 5. Knight to King's Bishop 5.
I am hard put to explain it to him who guards France while I sleep, who labours unceasingly while I amuse myself.
Your Majesty refers to God?
I refer to Cardinal Richelieu, which is not quite the same thing. Ah, Cardinal. This matter of Treville's musketeers.
Broken heads and broken swords. Trifles, sire. The Duke of Buckingham is in Paris.
Buckingham? Here? Why, in God's name? To plot against my honor.
The Queen?
You will arrest the plotter.
Sire, you are wrong. The Queen is faithful to you and to France. She loves your Majesty far too warmly.
I'm not scorched by the heat.
Although it is well done, you can hear in that scene that the voice doesn't quite match the actions. The voice in this case is Richard Briers, who is most famous perhaps in the UK for his role in The Good Life. King Louis is foppish, ineffectual, petty, jealous, and clearly not the real power behind the French court. Next we meet the Duke of Buckingham. As mentioned previously, Queen Anne's long-distance love interest, and the cause of many problems that the Three Musketeers and others have to face throughout this film.
One moment, sir, if you please.
But you promised.
Yes, and I can see now why you made me promise.
You have nothing to do with me, sir.
No, but I have something to do with this lady.
Take my arm, madame. Good evening, sir.
In God's name, my lord.
My lord? Are you?
The Duke of Buckingham. Now do you see? You can spoil everything.
Oh, my darling, forgive me. My lord, what can I say? I love her, and I was jealous.
A perfectly excellent reason for attacking a stranger in the dark. Would you oblige me in a small matter, sir?
Anything, my lord.
Madame and I are going to the palace. We must not be seen. If anyone should try to follow us, would you be good enough to kill him? Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Buckingham is played by Simon Ward, again a famous English actor who has had many roles on stage and screen and will be probably recognisable to many people. The final character I want to mention at this point is barely in the film at all. He is simply credited as Spy, but he's played by another English comedy actor, Rodney Bewes, who's in a TV series called The Likely Lads in the 60s.
The following conversation took place in the bedchamber of Madame Bonacieux at the palace. The Queen said, I am lost, I am lost. Madame Bonacieux said, Majesty. Constance, I am lost. Majesty. What can I do, Constance? We can get the studs back. Lord Buckingham, in 14 days from London, I am lost. Majesty, in 14 days, a messenger can reach London and return to Paris with the studs. And a messenger who? I can trust no one. That devil has informers everywhere. That evil, filthy, revolting, wretched man, evil, filthy, revolting, evil man, calls himself a man of the church. According to this.
I include it here because it is again an excellent use by Richard Lester of comedy to convey information in what would otherwise perhaps have been quite a dull scene. Rodney Bewes' character obviously dislikes his employer, Richelieu, and uses his position to allow him to vent some of his frustration and distaste under the cover of his transcript. And so, at this point, I have covered all of the cinematography aspects of the film I wish to cover, and all of the characters that I wanted to talk about in any detail. But this is not the end of the review of the best sword fighting film of all time, because we've barely touched upon the sword fighting in any way, shape or form. But this will have to wait until part 2, so I hope you will join me in that video. Until then, take care.